Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy the Cartoon Reviewer here, and welcome back to another countdown. In this video, we will be looking at the best episodes of Simpsons Season 8. And Season 8 is an interesting one for sure. Well, not my personal favorite, and I think it's a step down from Seasons 7 and 6 overall. That doesn't mean the direction this season takes the show in is a bad one. After how character study and story focused the last two seasons were, giving us great insight into the world around us, this season is more focused on big new ideas and experimentation. Throwing the Simpsons characters into any ideas the writers can think of, and seeing how it turns out. Sure, you lose some of the more complex character work and more developed stories from last time for the most part, but you get a very different season that really tries to push the boundaries of what a Simpsons episode could be as the show experiments, and subverts your expectations through bending the way any given story could be told. This puts the focus back on fun new ideas that are more focused on witty comedy, and if the episode explores anything, it's usually just to make a point, not to be a big thematic episode like last time. While I do love what Season 6 and 7 have to offer, Season 8 is a cool new direction for the show to take. And on top of that, it still mixes in some more character and story-driven stuff, along with episodes that deal with complex subjects. With that said though, Season 8 being so experimental and trying so many different things does lead to a lot of great episodes, but it also leads to a lot of episodes that while I enjoy them quite a bit, I'm just not really that passionate about them. This was one of the hardest lists I've ever had to make because I just wasn't super crazy about many of the great episodes this time around. Also, because the season is so experimental, it felt like I was picking which experiment I felt worked the most. Between these two factors, choosing which episodes should land where was difficult. But, with all that said, I did, and all 5 of these and the honorable mentions are still great episodes that deserve to be recognized for ending the golden age of The Simpsons in an amazing way. So here is my list of the top 5 best Simpsons Season 8 episodes. We start this list with one of the last great Lisa episodes from the classic seasons. This episode is one of the few in the season that is focused on exploring its characters. And while this episode does a good job looking at Lisa and tells a good story about how she deals with her weird crush on Nelson and how this affects her, it's also a great examination of Nelson's character. This episode just pairs 2 really different characters together and gets a fun dynamic out of it. How Lisa is really nice and sensitive and is really intrigued with Nelson because she finds him interesting and kinda charming for how uninteresting and uncharming he is, and Nelson just kind of appreciates the attention at points, even if he doesn't really care about Lisa's pursuits. Really, this episode is just Lisa hanging out with Nelson, trying to figure out why she likes him, and if she can change some of his faults to make him a better person, and her trying to figure out if there's a sweeter side to him at all. It could have been boring if it wasn't for how interesting both these characters are, how sweet the character bits can be, and how truly funny this episode is at points. Especially all the Milhouse scenes. Also, the story does go some interesting places. I like this weird relationship Nelson and Lisa have, and how the whole situation really challenges Lisa. How she figures out hanging out and kissing Nelson is nice and sweet, but he just isn't a good person. And being in a relationship with someone in hopes of trying to change them is wrong and pointless. And Nelson learns he can't be in a relationship with someone if there is no trust he's gonna be a good and caring person. The episode is so interesting for how it explores these characters and how it represents what it feels like to have a crush at a young age and not always know why and what could come out of it. And it's something most people can connect to from their youth in some way, which makes it one of the best of the season. The reason it is so low is because this episode at points can feel a little too by the books with how this story would be told, and the story is not as fleshed out as it could be. Also, while the subplot is funny, it doesn't really add anything, and disrupts the story at points for no reason. Which is why the episode pales in comparison to some other great Lisa episodes. So even though a Lisa episode topped the last two lists, this is the highest on this one, as there are 4 episodes that are just stronger for those reasons. This episode was actually only gonna be in the honorable mentions until the very last second, when I rewatched a few episodes, this one included, to know the exact order of this list. And I'm glad I did, because this one is a lot better than I think I gave it credit for just rewatching it the first time for this video. As I said, Season 8 has a lot of episodes that just go all in on these big ideas the show hasn't tried before, and this is one of the best examples. The concept of this episode is wonderful. It involves Springfield enacting Prohibition and Homer becoming a beer baron. It's so much fun, because the episode goes so far with this idea, which leads to so many funny moments. From the parody of Prohibition stories, to the way Homer and others try to sneak alcohol, to all the little one-liners and moments involving how weird and wacky this premise is, and especially Rex Banner, and every scene involving him. He is just such a great parody of these kinds of characters in a Prohibition story like this, and every scene with him is perfect. Yes, the actual story of this episode is just a very simple Prohibition parody of people who illegally sell beer, but the episode puts such a fun Simpsons spin on it all, and tells the most fun version of this story while having joke after joke. And the reason in particular this episode landed above some of its competition is just because of how far it goes with its parody and in telling great jokes. I will say, this episode in places maybe could have gone a bit further with making the story itself a little more unique and interesting, because once you get past the jokes and how weird some scenes are, the story is pretty simple, and when the episode isn't being hilarious and wacky, it's not the most engaging, but this rarely happens, and the episode is just so much fun throughout most of it that it's a very minor problem overall. But it means it does pale in comparison to the next 3, which are very strong and considered by many to be some of the best that the entire show has to offer. Now we're getting into some really strong ones. This is just such a meta episode that makes such interesting statements on the cartoon and television industry at the time, along with making jokes at The Simpsons' longevity at this point and what could and kinda did happen moving forward, while also having some of the most iconic jokes of the entire show. This episode is a laugh riot, with so many quotable lines and classic scenes. Everything involving Poochie, from his origin to the cartoon he stars in, and especially his death, and the build-up to it and that payoff, it's all just so good. But the reason all this works is because the story of the episode is very self-aware and very well written. Having Itchy and Scratchy in the process of declining ratings, and the creators having to add a new character with little thought and effort put in just to boost ratings, that ends up being voiced by Homer, and it all going so horribly wrong, is a great plot. It allows them to make commentary on so many things involving cartoons, while also giving the story a more personal edge, with showing how important this all is to Homer, and his struggle with the project being crap, and trying to save it in his own way as much as he can. It gives the episode a really multi-layered edge of being this interesting look into the world of animation production, from a crappy, thoughtless executive side, and as someone who is passionate about voice acting a character. It's one of the most interesting episodes of the show, and it does really tackle some topics and practices that may have hurt many shows over the years, The Simpsons included. And that's what makes this one truly one of a kind and something special. Now, the reason this isn't any higher is because some of the themes brought up aren't as developed as they could be, and this isn't the funniest episode of the season, as not all the jokes really work for me, so this will never be one of my personal favorites, but it's still such a unique and special one, and definitely one of the best of this season. The top two episodes on this list were incredibly close in quality. Both episodes are some of the best the show has ever put out for very different reasons, and they both have their strengths that could easily justify either one being at the top. But, in the end, You Only Move Twice ended up here. But that doesn't change the fact that this is one of the funniest episodes of the show. The concept is so bizarre, and such a fun spin on a normal sitcom-y trope. The entire family moves to a new town that they think will be great, but everyone hates it for different reasons besides Homer. And it leads to Homer having to leave this new place he loves so much for them. Now, this is a super generic story on paper, but what makes this into one of the best episodes of the show is that around all of this, Homer's new boss, Hank Scorpio, is a supervillain who is trying to take over the East Coast. It's just so funny watching Homer and his family deal with this new lifestyle while Homer is oblivious to Scorpio's evil deeds. They get so much material out of this man's plans and the violence and destruction that happens around him, especially at the end when his organization fights with the military, and Homer is oblivious to all of it because he is just so dumb and wrapped up in whatever he is thinking about when he comes to talk to Scorpio about moving back to Springfield during this conflict. And on top of that, Hank Scorpio makes this episode. He carries every scene, and this idea would not work as well as it does if every line he said wasn't comedy gold. The episode has so many funny scenes and jokes because of this premise, and even all the other jokes about the family not liking this new town and Homer trying to work this job are also great because of how subversive and punchy they are to how you'd expect this episode to go about this plot. With all that said though, there isn't anything that interesting going on in the actual main story. The family moves, everyone but Homer doesn't like it, and then they move away. While the weird stuff with Hank Scorpio happening in the background is great, there is nothing really that interesting or even engaging here besides that. But that's not the point of the episode. Its only goal is to mess around with this base story by throwing a supervillain angle on top of it to tell the best jokes, and it works. I have no real issues with this episode that bring the quality down for me, and it's pretty much perfect for what it tries to accomplish. But the episode I put at number 1 just does something that interests me more than just being one of the funniest episodes of the show. And if you've watched season 8, you know what that one will be, but this episode is still a crowning achievement for The Simpsons as a comedy show and deserves all the credit for that. But before we get into what my favorite episode of the season is, here are 12 honorable mentions that just missed the list. All of these episodes are great for various reasons, proving just how diverse Season 8 could be at its best, even if none of these are my personal favorites. Treehouse of Horror 7 is the last classic Treehouse of Horror episode, and is a great one to go out on. Sure, it doesn't have my favorite set of stories, which is why it didn't make the list, but it has 3 very strong ones that accomplish 3 very different tones and ideas really well. And Citizen Kang is such a strong segment that it does make me like the episode much more. This episode just has a good story with some fun twists and turns and a great song number. There are many great setups for jokes, and those jokes take the episode a long way. Sure, the story is still very simple, and its twists and turns are more for comedy's sake, so this episode wouldn't be as strong as it is without its humor, but it's so good because the episode is really funny, so the episode at least deserves a mention. This is an episode I think is great, but had the potential to be much stronger than it actually is. I love the first 2 acts of this episode, the way they build up to Kirk and Luann's divorce, and when it actually happens, it's really interesting because how they paint this picture of such a dysfunctional marriage coming to an end. But it also leads to many great jokes. I think the episode could be so much better with how it tackles the Marge and Homer stuff at the end. Well, I think it's great, and it's interesting how the episode builds up to it in a subversive way. It's just not as developed as I'd like it to be, keeping the episode off the list proper. This is an episode I think I like a lot less than other people, but I still like it a lot. I like how this episode paints Ned's character, and how it slowly builds up to his freakout scene so well. And that scene is hilarious, but I think the back end of this episode just isn't as complex or interesting as the first half, even if overall this is still a strong character study episode for Ned. This one will never be one of my personal favorites, as I have no attachment to what the episode is parodying, and the story on its own is too simple, and hard to get into for that reason. But this episode makes up for that with amazing jokes and references that are still funny nonetheless. This episode is just insanity, and it's so much fun. It goes all in on its concept, which leads to a fun character dynamic between Homer and Mr. Burns here. So many fun set pieces, and an amazing setup that leads to so many great jokes to even begin to count. But I just don't find this episode funny enough to justify putting it on the list above something like Lisa's Day with Density or Homer vs. the 18th Amendment, but it was pretty close. Just a fun Mary Poppins parody that really puts a fun Simpsons-y twist on this magical story for how unfun and unmagical it is, leading to some great songs and jokes, but nothing too spectacular. This episode has a really good story that gives us an interesting look at Homer's character through this situation, while also discussing themes of bigotry in a way that isn't dated. The episode sides with John and shows that he is a great person, and the episode makes Homer look like a fool for his homophobic views. But the story of Homer trying to make sure his son doesn't turn out gay does lead to some really funny scenes. I guess the reason the episode didn't make the list proper was because it doesn't have a ton to say on the issue of gay rights, and Homer's development into acceptance is a little bit underdeveloped and not the most meaningful. But being this progressive at the time is still a big enough win. Brother from Another Series is a great cheer celebration, and a really different Sideshow Bob episode that is a lot of fun for that reason. Cecil is a fun addition, the story is really good with some fun twists and turns, and the gags are on point. I guess the drawback is I'm not super familiar with Frasier, and this isn't the most entertaining of the season on its own, but it's still one of Bob's best. Grade School Confidential is an episode that barely missed the list. I love the development we get to both Seymour and Edna here. I love their relationship and just how sweet the episode is at points. And all the gags of Bart being caught in the middle of this are just so funny. This episode has a lot of sweetness and character development that is missing from the rest of the season, and I really wanted to put it on the list for that reason, because that's usually what I lean towards when it comes to Best of The Simpsons. But I just find Lisa's date with Density to be a little more interesting overall. This was another episode that was very close to making the list, and it was gonna be on there until the last second when I rewatched a few episodes, including this one, and swapped it out for other choices. Look, I love this story. I like how this episode dissects Burns, and his pairing with Lisa is so interesting and funny and leads to some great scenes. And the story goes some weird places at the end that are so hilarious. But I just don't think this episode looks at its characters in as interesting a way as A Date with Density does, or many other Lisa and Burns episodes do, which is why it didn't make the list, though this would probably be number 6 or 7. The last honorable mention for the last classic season of The Simpsons. This is a great look at Reverend Lovejoy, who hadn't really been a main character in an episode up until this point. It's so interesting to see why he is in the position he is in, involving Ned in the church, and how circumstances break him out of this rut. It's also a really funny episode. I know, shocker. But this episode takes a little while to get going and doesn't do anything too incredible to land on the list. And with that said, let's finish this list and finally get into my favorite episode of Simpsons Season 8. So going into the video, I bet everyone expected either this or You Only Move Twice to land at number 1, if I didn't put an Oddball Lisa episode on there instead. And while You Only Move Twice is a truly great one, Homer's Enemy is just one of the most interesting episodes of the entire show, that really plays around with the idea of how stupid Homer can be without being unlikable or annoying. The way it accomplishes this is through Frank Grimes. Frank Grimes is one of the best Simpsons one-off characters because he is everything Homer isn't. He is hardworking and smart, and everything in life hasn't been handed to him. But the biggest difference between him and Homer is he just isn't very likable, at least in contrast with Homer during their time together. Now don't get me wrong, Frank Grimes has every reason to be mad at Homer, and Homer is generally pretty annoying at points. I'm not saying that Frank Grimes isn't sympathetic. You would be mad as well in the same situation. But you know that Homer means well, and is actively trying to be friendly and nice to Grimes, even if the stuff he does is just so idiotic, and he is so oblivious this entire episode to how Grimes really feels, and unintentionally harms him a little bit at points. But this back and forth is not only hilarious, as they get so much comedic material out of it because Homer is so dumb and annoying, and Grimes is such a straight man to it all, which you don't usually see. These interactions are comedy gold when they really shouldn't be for this reason. It should be obnoxious watching Homer accidentally annoy Grimes and do such stupid things as eat his lunch and nearly get him fired through his own stupidity, even if the latter wasn't necessarily his fault and he couldn't have predicted that outcome. He still did almost drink acid. But it isn't because of how likable Homer is and how you know he isn't trying to do any harm, and Grimes' reactions are just so real to life and different from how everyone else reacts. And the points he makes are good ones, but they just don't stick in any case because it's Homer. And on top of that, they also use the story and these interactions to explore Homer as a character and as an idea for one. Homer is someone who in many aspects gets dumber and dumber every season, even early on, but this episode really plays around with this idea by throwing someone like Frank Grimes, who is a real person in many ways and has such an understandable but funny response to all his antics. This episode just does such a good job making you laugh, but also throwing you in this weird situation with two very different characters for so many reasons, and really tests your tolerance for Homer's stupidity, and if the writers can create a situation where someone is this annoying and another guy is this sympathetic and reasonable and even relatable to an extent, because I do relate to Grimes in a way and some of the points he is making, but you end up still liking the guy who's essentially being dumb and annoying more. That's why this episode really blows me away and kind of messes with my brain a little bit. The episode just pushes this experiment so far to unbelievable levels, and it's great. I've never seen an episode bend a character like this so much through such an interesting plot and go this far with a concept as strange and as out there, and on top of that, it's just 8 seasons of some of Homer's more hit or miss aspects done at its very best. It just explores so much of Homer's character while making commentary on his role in the show like no other episode does. It's a really character-defining episode and one of Homer's best, while still having some of the best jokes of the series. Not even just the Homer and Frank Grimes back and forth stuff, but the Bart stuff and everything else, even really small things. The Bart stuff is light fluff that does break up the main story well, and is used to be another one of Frank Grimes' points against Homer to a great extent. And the ending scene is so dark but funny because of how it's framed, which shouldn't even be possible for something this disturbing. The episode really messes with your perception on how you usually like your characters, even more comedic ones, to act and be written to make them likable. And the episode is just so different, and there's no other Simpsons episode like it for this reason. Do I even need to go on? This one is a fan favorite by many, and so many people have dived into why this episode is so complex for this reason, because it's just so meta and just so interesting, and in a season that loved to experiment, I can't think of another episode that deserves to top this list more than this one, making it the best episode of Simpsons Season 8. And with that, the list is done, and I'm finally done making lists on classic seasons of The Simpsons after over 2 years. Well, kind of. I've decided I'm not super interested in doing a worst list for seasons 3 through 8 because there are so few bad episodes. While I might do it eventually, that won't come out in the near future. I will, however, be posting a top 10 best Simpsons seasons 1 through 8 episodes lists in December, like I did last year with SpongeBob seasons 1 through 3, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching, and I apologize that it's been a while since my last video. I've been trying to figure out what I want to do with this channel and how I want to make videos going forward in the 2 months I've been gone. And I know I decided last time I wanted to make more scripted podcast type videos, but I realized I didn't love that idea as much as I thought. And I do really like edited content and do enjoy editing, I just didn't love the way I was going about it. It just wasn't working, and was doing too much of it around a tight schedule. So I made some changes, and the editing process for this video was great and went very smoothly. I also decided while making this video, I wanted to keep these lists going forward in one part, but take efforts to make them shorter while still showcasing my opinions on whatever I'm talking about, which is why this list is a little less in-depth, but hopefully just as informative on my opinions, and maybe a little less redundant with less of a chance to repeat myself throughout. These 2 changes are how I'm gonna make videos going forward. And on top of that, I have 3 other things I need to announce. First, I'm gonna use the rest of the year to experiment with content, talking about new shows and making other videos that aren't lists. I will finish the projects I've started, but I've decided to push those back once again to spend the next few months experimenting. Secondly, going forward, I will be posting at least one video a month, hopefully more, but I'm not gonna promise anything more than that until I can reasonably make a promise like that. Lastly, I'm going to rebrand the channel back to Chocolate Guy Reviews, because there's more I want to talk about than just cartoons. Even if for the near future, that will be my main focus, because that's my main interest of what I want to talk about on this channel, I do want to talk about live action shows as well. This is just gonna be a TV show list/review channel once again. But with all that said, thank you guys for over 2 years of watching me on YouTube. I know I'm a little late to that, but thank you all so much. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe for more videos similar to it in the future. Also, comment down below on what you thought of my list and what your own would have been. The music I used in this video is linked in the description below. All images and music used here belong to their respected creators, and stay tuned for the next video where I will be looking at the best and worst episodes of Ben 10 Season 1. And with all that said, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off.